The Killing of the Khazar Kings by J. G. Frazer. Source: Folklore, Volume 28, Number 4, December 31st, 1917. Pages 382 to 407. At a certain stage of social evolution, not a few races appear to have been in the habit of putting their kings to death, either at the end of a fixed term or on the failure of the king's health and strength, or simply whenever a great public calamity, such as drought or famine, had befallen the country. Among the peoples who have practiced this remarkable system of limited monarchy and have elevated regicide to the dignity of a public institution must seemingly be numbered the Khazars or Khazars, a nation of southeastern Russia, who in the Middle Ages maintained their independence for many centuries, alike against Persia and the Byzantine Empire, carried on a busy trade between the East and the West, and repelled the wave of Mohammedan conquest, which, but for the resistance, might have deluged Europe from the southeast. It is hardly too much to say that during those dark ages when the power of Christendom sank to its lowest ebb and the power of Islam rose to its highest pitch, Europe was protected against the swelling tide of Moslem aggression by three great mountain barriers: the Caucasus on the southeast, the Balkans in the center, and the Pyrenees on the southwest, and that the passes which led over these ranges into the heart of the continent were guarded by three peoples: the Khazars, the Byzantine Greeks, and the Spaniards. Of these three redoubtable champions of Christendom, the Khazars have long disappeared, and even their name is now hardly known but to students of the bypaths of history. Yet for some 900 years or more, 190 to 1100 AD, this almost forgotten people played a great part in history on the borderland of Europe and Asia. Their home was in the spurs of the Caucasus and along the western shore of the Caspian, which took its name, Sea of the Khazars, from them. But at the height of their power, they ruled over the whole of southeastern Russia, from the Dnieper to the Middle Volga, together with the adjoining part of Asia along the eastern coast of the Caspian as far south as Astrabad. On the south, their boundary never altered greatly. At times, indeed, it extended southward as far as the Cyrus and even the Araxes. But on that side, the Khazars had to face the Byzantine and Persian empires and were, for the most part, restrained within the passes of the Caucasus. Their capital was Idle in the delta of the Volga, but they possessed other populous and civilized cities such as Semender, Tarku, which was the older capital, and Sarkal of the White Abode on the Don. All the Khazar cities were centers of commerce. Indeed, the Khazars have been described as the Venetians of the Caspian and the Euxine, the organizers of the transit between the two basins, the universal carriers between East and West. Merchants from every nation found protection, justice, and good faith in the Khazar cities. Exiled from Constantinople, the Jews sought a home among them, developed their trade, and contended with their Mohammedan and Christian rivals for the religious allegiance of the pagan people. The reigning house accepted Judaism apparently about the middle of the 8th century, but all faiths were equally tolerated, and every man was held amenable to the authorized code and to the official judges of the religion which he professed. At the Byzantine court, the Khan, or sovereign of the Khazars, was held in high honor. The emperor, Justinian Rhinotometus, took refuge with him during his banishment and married his daughter. His rival, Bardanes, also sought an asylum in the land of the Khazars, and in Leo IV, the grandson of a Khazar sovereign, ascended the Byzantine throne. The origin and affinities of this interesting people appear to be still disputed. Many have assigned them to the Turkish stock, others to the Ugrians or Eastern Finns, and some have even claimed them as Jews on account of their use of the Hebrew character and the profession of the Hebrew faith among them. But their geographical position, their history, and the contemporary witness we have as to their physical character, their language, and their own national tradition may be accepted as conclusive proof that the Khazars were an indigenous people of the Caucasus and near akin to the Armenians and the Georgians. It is very remarkable that a custom of legalized regicide should have been practiced among a people so comparatively advanced and civilized as the Khazars appear to have been, and of whom it has been said that their government was regular, settled, and well organized. They were not wild barbarians like the Huns and the Avars. Their case escaped me when I was collecting instances of such legalized regicide for the Golden Bough. My attention was first drawn to it in 1912 by Miss Barbara Frere Mareko, who was so kind as to send me a long extract on the subject from the medieval Arab historian and geographer Feda. Subsequently, the Khazar practice of killing their sacred kings was described by Mr. Gezer Roheim in an article contributed to Man. But as his account seems to be based on the works of modern Hungarian historians, and the Khazar custom is probably still but little known, it may be worthwhile to put together those passages of medieval authors which describe in some detail the Khazar kings and their limited tenure of the crown. All the authors in question appear to be Arabs, or at least to have written in Arabic, but their works are accessible to the unlearned in translations, from which I borrow the following extracts. Some of the most important passages were long ago collected and edited in Arabic with Latin translations by C.M. Friend in the Memoirs of the Academy of St. Petersburg. The earliest writer to give an account of the Khazar kings from personal observation was Ahmed ibn Fadlan, or Fadlan, as his name is variously spelled, who traveled through Khazaria in the year 921 or 922 AD, at a time when the kingdom was still at the height of its power and glory. He was sent from Baghdad by the Caliph Muqtadir on an embassy to the king of the Bulgarians, whose dominions then lay on the Volga in central Russia, and on his return to Baghdad, he described in a book all that he had observed worthy of note on his journey. His work appears to be lost, but the portion of it which relates to the Khazars was fortunately incorporated in his geographical dictionary by the Arab writer Yakut, who, after a checkered life as a slave, commercial traveler, bookseller, copyist, and author, died near Aleppo in the year 1229 AD. The following are extracts from it. Ahmed, son of Fadlan, sent as envoy of the Caliph Muqtadir to the Slavs, related in a little book everything that he saw with his own eyes in these regions. And in that book, he says that the Khazar is the name of a certain country, of which the capital is called Aitul. Aitul is also the name of the river Volga, which flows from Russia and Bulgaria to Khazaria. Aitul is the city, Khazar in the name of the kingdom, not of the city. The city is in two parts, of which the larger is situated on the western bank of the river, Aitul, Volga, while the other lies on the eastern side of the river. The king resides in the western part. In their tongue he is called Ilek and also Bak. This western part extends to the length of a parasang and is surrounded by a wall, but the buildings in it are few and far between. Now their edifices are huts made of felt, with a few exceptions which are made of mud. They have marketplaces and baths. Many Mohammedans are found there. Indeed, there are said to be more than 10,000 of them in the town, and they have 30 mosques. The king's palace is at a distance from the bank of the river and is built of baked bricks. No other person besides him is privileged to dwell in a house made of bricks, for the king will not suffer it. In the wall there are 4 gates, of which one leads to the river, and another to the desert, beyond the fields of the city. Their king is a Jew, and he is said to have 4,000 retainers attached to his person. The Khazars themselves, however, are Mohammedans and Christians. Idolaters are also found among them. The fewest numerically in the country are the Jews, though the king himself is of their number. The most numerous are the Mohammedans and the Christians. Nevertheless, the king and his retainers profess the Jewish religion. In the manners of the idolaters, the most noticeable feature is that they prostrate themselves in token of reverence for each other and observe certain sacred ordinances according to customs, which differ from the religion of the Mohammedans, Jews, and Christians. The king's standing army consists of 12,000 soldiers, of whom, as soon as one is dead, another is enlisted in his place, nor is their number ever diminished. Their pay is neither large nor frequent. Indeed, what they get is very little, and even that at long intervals, when either a war is to be waged by them or some calamity has occurred, on account of which they are mustered. The public revenues of the kingdom of the Khazars are derived either from the customs or from tithes levied on merchandise, and these dues, in accordance with their institutions, are levied on every highway, sea, and river. Land taxes are also collected from the inhabitants of villages and districts on every sort of food, drink, and other things, so far as is necessary. The king is assisted by 9 judges chosen from among the Jews, Christians, Mohammedans, and idolaters. If any person takes the law of another, these judges decide his suit. Petitioners are not allowed access to the king himself, for none but these judges are admitted to his presence. But on the day of judgment, an intermediary goes backward and forward between the judges and the king, informing the king of the business in hand and reporting to the judges the king's command which they must carry out. This city, Ital, has no villages. The fields of the citizens are scattered over a space of 20 parasangs, and in summer the townspeople go forth to them, sow them, and when the crops are ripe, they gather them and convey them in wagons or ships to the river or the deserts. The greater part of their food consists of rice and fish. Everything else found in their country is imported from Russia, Bulgaria, and Kujaba. Most of the merchants dwell in the eastern part of the city. There too the Mohammedans reside, and the wares are stored. The language of the Khazars differs from the Turkish and the Persian, nor has it anything in common with the language of any people. The Khazars are not like the Turks. They have black hair. There are 2 sorts of them. The one sort are called the Kara Khazars, that is, the black Khazars. They are of a dusky complexion verging on black, so that they might be mistaken for a species of Indians. The other sort are of a white complexion, and remarkable for their beauty and symmetry. All the slaves found among the Khazars are idolaters. For the idolaters deem it lawful to sell their children and to carry off their fellows into slavery, whereas the Jews and Christians who dwell in that country esteem it contrary to their religion to carry off people into slavery, and the Mohammedans are of the same opinion. Nothing is exported from the land of the Khazars to other countries, but whatever is conveyed down from it has first been imported into it, such as flour, honey, wax, and the skin of otters and other animals. As for the king of the Khazars, whose title is Kakan, He does not show himself in public except once in every 4 months, when he goes forth for his diversion to his pleasances. He is called the Great Kakan, and his viceroy is called the Kakan BH. It is the latter who leads and commands the armies, administers and superintends the affairs of state, appears in public, and conducts warlike expeditions. It is he whom neighboring kings obey. Every day he consults the sovereign Kakan with an assumed air of modesty, respect, and gravity. Nor may he approach him except barefoot and holding in his hand a stick, which after saluting him, he kindles in his presence. After that, he sits down with the king on his own throne to the right of the monarch. After him comes a man who is called Kinderkakan, and after him again another who is called Shashiar. It is the custom that the supreme and sovereign king admits nobody to an interview. Nobody is admitted to him except him who I mentioned before. The government, the punishment of the guilty, and the administration of the realm are presided over by the viceroy, the Kakan Vh. It has been ordained by their ancestors that when the sovereign king dies, a great palace mausoleum should be built for him, divided into 20 chambers, and that in each chamber there should be dug a grave, the bottom of which should be paved with stones so crushed as to present the appearance of powdered antimony, while the whole is covered from above with quicklime. Under the palace flows a great river, and they make the grave above it, saying that this is done lest Satan, or man, or worm, or other creeping thing should approach it. When the king is buried, the heads of those who laid him to rest are cut off, that no man may know in which of the chambers his grave is situated. The grave of his is called Paradise, and he himself is said to have entered Paradise. Moreover, all the chambers are tapestried with cloth of gold. It is customary for the king of the Khazars to have 25 wives, all daughters of one or other of the neighboring kings, whom he has married with or without their consent. Further, he has 60 concubines, all remarkable for their beauty. Each one of these women dwells in a palace of her own, in a Kaaba, vaulted chamber, roofed with the wood of the Indian plain. About each Kaaba, a tent is pitched. Every one of these damsels is attended by a eunuch, who guards her behind a curtain. Now, when the king desires to take his pleasure with any of them, he sends to the eunuch her guardian, by whom in less than the twinkling of an eye she is brought and placed in the king's bed. But the eunuch stands sentinel before the door of the royal chamber, and when the damsel is dismissed by the king, the eunuch takes her by the hand and leads her home, and does not thereafter leave her even for a moment. When the sovereign king rides on horseback in public, the whole army marches out to escort him in procession. But an interval of a mile is left between him and these cavalry. Nor does any of his subjects see him without falling on his face and humbly doing him reverence, and not raising his head until the king has passed by. 40 years are fixed for the king's reign. If he exceeds that term even by one day, his citizens and courtiers put him to death, alleging as the reason that his mental powers are decayed and his wisdom impaired. A regiment sent by him on an expedition never turns its back on the enemy. For were it to take to flight, every soldier who should return to the king would pay for it with his head. But if the officers or the viceroy run away, the king sends for them with their wives and children, and in their presence bestows their wives and children on others, together with their beasts of burden, furniture, weapons, and houses. It sometimes happens that he cuts them through the middle and hangs up the severed parts. Sometimes he hangs them by the neck from trees. Occasionally, when he is favorably disposed to them, he makes them his grooms. Such is the account of the Khazar kings, which the Arab geographer Yakut has extracted from the original narrative of Ahmed ibn Fadlan. In the National Library at Paris, there is preserved a manuscript abridgment of Yakut's work, in which his account of the Khazars and their king is condensed into a few lines as follows. Country of the Khazars, a numerous race of Turks who dwell to the north of Babel Aboab. They are of two sorts, the one white, the other blonde or red. Their houses are made of mud. They have marketplaces and baths. They dwell on the banks of the river Atel. Among them are many Mussulmans, Christians, Jews, and pagans. When their king has reigned more than 40 years, they kill him. Further, we possess accounts of the Khazars and their kings written by two other Arab travelers and geographers of the 10th century AD. One of these is Abu Hassan Ali, commonly known as Al-Masudi because he was descended in the 8th generation from Masud, one of the companions of Muhammad. Born at Baghdad towards the end of the 9th century AD, he spent a great part of his life in travel. Among the countries which he visited were India, Ceylon, China, Madagascar, and the region of the Caspian. He did not travel for gain. His motive was scientific curiosity. He desired to see every land for himself and to observe and record everything notable in the antiquities, the history and the manners of the peoples. His most famous book, which bears the fanciful title Meadows of Gold and Mines of Precious Stones, was begun in the year 332 of the Hegira 943 to 4 AD and finished in the year 336, 947 to 8 AD. It has survived in an abridgment, of which there are many manuscripts in European libraries. On account of the range of his observations and his naive, uncritical honesty in recording them, he has been called the Arab Herodotus. The parallel, however, must be taken with great deductions. Of the Meadows, the work by which Masudi is chiefly known, by far the greater part, is an historical compilation, enlivened indeed in some parts by personal recollections of places and the like, but mainly drawn from a vast mass of earlier books which are used in the common paste and scissors fashion of Eastern history. Even in the earlier cosmographical chapters, the author's vast and miscellaneous reading, which include the Arabic translations of Ptolemy and other Greek writers, is mingled with his original observations in that ill-digested style so often characteristic of men of prodigious acquisitive power. The following is Al-Masudi's account of the Khazars and their kings. The nation nearest to Bab el-Abwab are the Haidan. They form one of the kingdoms of the Khazars. Next to Hedan is the kingdom of the Khazars. Their metropolis was the city of Semender, which is 8 days' journey from the town of Bab el-Abwab. The city has a numerous population of Khazars, but it is no longer the capital, for when Suleiman bin Rabia el-Bahili conquered Semender in the beginning of the Islam, the king transferred his residence to Aitel, which is 7 days' journey from Semender, and since this time the kings of the Khazars reside there. This town, Aitel, is divided into 3 parts by a large river, which rises from the higher regions of the country of the Turks, from which an arm branches off somewhere near the country of the Targiz Bulgarians and falls into the Sea of the Maeotis. This town has 2 sides. In the middle of the river is an island in which the king resides. The palace of the king stands on the extremity of this island and is connected by a bridge of boats with one of the 2 sides of the town. In this town are many Muslims and Christians, Jews and pagans. The king, his suite, and the Khazar of his army embraced the tenets of the Jews in the reign of Er-Rashid. To this king flocked the Jews from all the Moslem districts and from the Byzantine Empire, for the emperor forced the Jews of his dominions to turn Christians and loaded the converts with favors. The present Byzantine emperor is Romanus II. One of the various pagan nations who live in the king of the Khazars country are the Sekilaba Sclavonians, and another, the Russians. They live in one of the two sides of this town. They burn the dead with their cattle, utensils, arms, and ornaments. When a man dies, his wife is burnt alive with him. But when the wife dies, her husband is not burnt. If a bachelor dies, he is married after his death. Women are glad to be burnt, for they cannot enter into paradise by themselves. This usage prevails also among the Hindus, as we have said, but the Hindus never burn a woman with her husband, unless it is her own wish. The majority of the population of this country are Muslims, for the standing army of the king consists of Muslims. They are called Al-Larigians and come from Khwarizm, whence they immigrated at an early period after the spreading of the Islam, on account of drought and plague which had visited their country. They are brave, good soldiers and form the strength of the king of the Khazars in his wars. They fixed certain conditions under which they would establish themselves in his country. One of these conditions was that they should be allowed to profess publicly the Islam, to build mosques and call out the prayers, and that the vizier of the kingdom should be a man of the region and nation. The vizier there is at present from amongst them. His name is Ahmed bin Kuwai. Another condition is that if the king of the Khazars should have a war against the Muslims, they would remain separate in his camp, observe neutrality, and not fight against the nation who profess the same religion. But they would fight for him against any other nation. There are at present 7,000 horsemen of theirs in the army of the king, armed with bows and equipped in cuirasses, helmets and coats of mail. He has also some spearsmen. In point of arms, they are like the soldiers in Muslim countries. Their supreme judges in religious and civil matters are Muslims. In accordance with the constitution of the kingdom of the Khazars, there are 9 supreme judges in the country, 2 of them for the Muslims, 2 for the Khazars, who follow the laws of the Pentateuch in passing sentence, 2 for the Christians, who follow the laws of the gospel in their decisions, and 1 for the Sclavonians, Russians, and the other pagan population. The pagan judge decides after the heathen laws, that is to say, the dictates of reason, not revelation. If any important case comes before him, he refers to the Muslim judges and lets them decide after the law of the Islam. There is no other king in these parts who has paid troops except the king of the Khazars. Every Muslim has there the name Larigian, although he may not be of this nation, and it has even extended such Russians and Sclavonians as serve in the standing army or household of the king. Although they are pagans, as we have said, but there are many Muslims in this kingdom besides the Larigians. They are artisans, tradespeople, and merchants who have been attracted by the justice and security of persons and property afforded by the government. They have a great public mosque, the minaret of which rises above the royal palace, and several private mosques where children are instructed in reading the Quran. If the Muslims and Christians who are there agree, the king has no power over them. Al-Masudi says, what we have said does not refer to the king of the Khazars himself, but we mean the Khan, major domus, for there is a king in the country of the Khazars besides the Khan. He is shut up in his place. He never makes a public procession, nor does he show himself to the nobility or the people, and he never goes out from his place. His person is sacred, but he has nothing to do with the affairs of the state, either to command or forbid. Everything is administered by the Khan for the king, who lives with him in the same palace. If a drought or any other misfortune befalls the country of the Khazars, or if a war or any other accident happens to them, the lower and higher classes of the nation run to the king and say, "The administration of this Khakan brings misfortune upon us. Put him to death or deliver him to us, that we may kill him." Sometimes he delivers him to them and they put him to death. At other times he takes charge himself of the execution, and sometimes he has pity on him, protects him, and sets him free without doing him any harm, although he might have deserved it. I do not know whether this institution dates from ancient times or whether it has been recently introduced. The Khakan is chosen from among the nobility by their chiefs, but I think that the royalty of the present dynasty takes date from a remote period. Another writer of the 10th century AD who has described the Khazars and their kings is the Arab traveler and geographer Abul Qasim Muhammad ibn Hawqal, or Hawqali, author of a work called Book of the Itineraries and of the Provinces, in which he describes the Mohammedan countries on the basis of his personal researches and of the journeys which he had undertaken for the purposes of commerce. He tells us that he began his researches and travels in early youth, and that he set out for Baghdad in the year 331 of the Hijra, 942 to 3 AD. But his book was not written till the year 366 of the Hijra, 976 to 7 AD. The manuscript of the original work in Arabic is preserved in the Library of Leyden, but is said to be so faulty and that the meaning is often unintelligible. The book exists also in a Persian translation, of which an English version was published by Sir William Useley. The portions of it which describe the tribes of the Caucasus, including the Khazars, are extracted and translated into French from the Arabic manuscript at Leyden by C. Diossen in his work on the peoples of the Caucasus. The following is the account which Ibn Hawqal gives of the Khazars and their kings, as translated by Sir William Useley from the Persian. After one passes Mukhan to Derbin for 2 days' journey, the country is Shirwan. From that to Samender, 14 days' journey, and from Samender to Atel. This Atel is a certain river which comes from Rus and Bulgar. One half of this river belongs to the western side, the other to the eastern. The sovereign of Atel resides on the western side. He is styled king and surnamed Baal. Here are many tents, and in this country there are but a few edifices of clay, such as bazaars, marketplaces, and bathing houses. In these territories are about 10,000 Mussulmans. The king's habitation is at a distance from the shore, is constructed of burnt bricks, and this is the only building of such materials in all the country. They will not allow anybody but the king to erect such a dwelling. The city of Atel has 4 gates. One of those gates faces the river, another looks towards Iran in the direction of the desert. The king of the country is a Jew. He has in his train 4,000 Mussulmans and Christians, and idolaters. But his principal people are Jews, and this king has 12,000 soldiers in his service, of whom when one dies, another person is immediately chosen into his place, and they have no other commander but him. And this king has under him 9 magistrates or judges. These are Mussulmans, Jews, Christians, and idolaters. Smallest in number of the inhabitants of the country are the Jews. The greatest in number are the Mussulmans and Christians. But the king and his chief officers are Jews. There are magistrates of each religion, and when they sit in the tribunal of justice, they are obliged to report to the king all that passes, and to bring back his answer and opinion, and to put his sentence into execution. This city has not any suburbs, but the cultivated fields and grounds extend for nearly 20 farsang. Agriculture is much practiced, and the husbandmen carry the produce of their labor in boats and carriages to the city. The chief diet of this people is fish and rice. They bring honey and wax from the borders of Rus. The principal persons of Atel are Mussulmans and merchants. Their language is like that of the Turks or Tartars, is not understood by any other nation. The people of Kors are near the Turks, whom they resemble. There are two classes, one of blackish complexions and such dark hair that you would suppose them to be descended from the Hindus. The other race fair complexioned. These sell their children, but it is not allowed among the Jews and the Christians to sell or make one another slaves. They bring from other countries those commodities which Khazar does not produce, such as tapestry or curtains, honey, candles, and similar articles. The people of Khazar have not materials for making garments or clothes. They therefore import them from Gurkhan, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Rome. Their king is styled the Khakan or of Khazar. When a prince is to be raised to the Khakanship, they bring him forth and tie a piece of silk around his throat so tight that he can scarcely draw his breath. At that moment they ask him how long he will hold the sovereignty. He answers so many years. He then is set at liberty and becomes Khakan of Khazar. But if he should not die before the expiration of the time he mentioned, when that space is fulfilled, they put him to death. The Khakan must always be of the imperial race. No one is allowed to approach him but on business of importance. Then they prostrate themselves before him and rub their faces on the ground until he gives orders for their approaching him and speaking. When a Khakan of Khazar dies, whoever passes near his tomb goes on foot and pay his respects at the grave. And when he is departing, must not mount on horseback as long as the tomb is within view. So absolute is the authority of this sovereign, and so implicitly are his commands obeyed, that if it seemed expedient to him that one of his nobles should die, and if he said to him, "Go and kill yourself," the man would immediately go to his house and kill himself accordingly. The succession to the Khakanship being thus established in the same family, when the turn of the inheritance arrives to any individual of it, he is confirmed in the dignity, though he possesses not a single dirham. And I have heard from persons worthy of belief that a certain young man used to sit in a little shop at the public marketplace, selling petty articles, and that the people used to say, "When the present Khakan shall have departed, this man will succeed to the throne." But the young man was a Mussulman, and they give the Khakanship only to Jews. The Khakan has a throne and pavilion of gold. These are not allowed to any other person. The palace of the Khakan is loftier than the other edifices. The language of Bulgar and of Khazar is the same. In the original of Ibn Hawqal's work, the account of the installation of the Khazar king appears to be slightly fuller than in the Persian version. The following translation of the passage is made from Friend's Latin version of the Arabic original. When the king is dead and another is to be appointed in his room, the Khakan has him brought and admonishes and exhorts him. He declares to him both what he owes to others and what others owe to him, that is to say, his royal rights and duties. He sets before him the burdens of monarchy and the reproach of sin and crime which he will incur if in the discharge of his office he should fall short of his duty in the administration which he is about to undertake, or should act rashly or show himself corrupt and unjust in the seat of judgment. Now when he is brought to be invested with the kingdom and to receive the salutations of his subjects, to strangle him, the Khakan puts a silken cord about his neck and begins to strangle him. And when he is almost choked, they ask him how many years he desires to reign, to which he answers such and such a number of years. Afterwards, if he dies before the expiry of the term, is well, but if not, whenever he attains to the appointed year, he is put to death. A similar but briefer report of the custom is given by the Arab cosmographer Shams-ed-Din Muhammad Damashqi. He seems to have derived his information about the Khazars from Ibn al-Asir, who died in 1233 AD. The passage relating to the appointment of the Khazar king runs as follows. They begin to strangle the man whom they wish to make their king. When he has thus been brought to the point of death, they ask him how many years he wishes to reign, and he answers, such and such a number of years. His answer is written down and attested by witnesses. If he should live till the expiry of the set term, he is put to death. It will be observed that, whereas in the Persian version of Ibn Hawqal, it is the new Khakan who is said to have been thus forcibly interrogated as to the length of his future reign. In the Arabic original and in Dimishki's account, it is the new king who is subjected to this stringent interrogatory. The discrepancy betrays a certain confusion between the two personages who divide the Khazar sovereignty between them. But the analogy of similar customs elsewhere renders it practically certain that it was the sacred and nominally supreme potentate, rather than his civil and nominally subordinate colleague, whose reign was limited in this peremptory fashion. The last notice of the Khazars or Khazars and their kings, which I shall cite, is extracted from the geography of the eminent Arab historian and geographer Feda, who was born at Damascus in 1273 AD and died in 1331 AD, at the ancient Syrian city of Hama, the biblical Hamath, of which he had been for many years before his death the hereditary prince and ruler. A gallant soldier and a distinguished writer, Feda appears not to have traveled very widely, hence, for the materials embodied in his geography, he must have been, in great measure, dependent on the works of his predecessors. The description which he gives of the Khazar kingdom is clearly based for the most part on the accounts of Ibn Fadlan, and Ibn Hawqal. It runs as follows. The river Volga traverses the country of the Russians and Bulgarians. The capital, also called Itol, is divided into two parts. The one is situated to the west of the river on the right bank and is the principal part. The other lies to the east. The king of the Khazars inhabits the western part. This king is called, in their language, Balek. He is also known as Bek. This part is about a parasang long. It is surrounded by a wall, but the wall is low. The houses of the inhabitants consist of tents made of felt. Only a small part is built of clay. The town includes marketplaces and baths. Mussulmans are to be found in it. The number of Mussulmans, they say, amounts to more than 10,000. They own about 30 mosques. The palace of the king is built at some distance from the river. It is constructed of bricks. There is no other house of bricks in the town. The king allows no man whatsoever the privilege of building a brick house. The wall which surrounds the town is pierced by 4 gates, some of them facing towards the river and the others towards the country. The king of the Khazars is a Jew. He keeps near his person, they say, about 4,000 men. Some of the Khazars are Mussulmans, others are Christians. A certain number are Jews. There are also some who worship idols. The Jews form the smallest number. The majority is composed of Mussulmans and Christians, but the king and his retinue prefer Judaism. For the rest, the manners of the Khazars are in general the manners of the idolaters. When they salute each other, they bow the head in token of respect. The administration of the capital is based on ancient customs, contrary to the religion of the Mussulmans, the Jews, and the Christians. The army is composed of 12,000 men. When one of these men dies, he is replaced by another. Their pay is small and scanty. The king's revenues arise from town dues and a tithe levied on merchandise on all the roads and every sea and river, in accordance with the system peculiar to the Khazars. He also obliges the inhabitants of the towns and country districts to furnish him with all the objects in kind which he needs. The king chooses 9 judges among the Jews, Christians, and Mussulmans and idolaters. When a suit is brought, it is these men who judge it. The parties do not apply to the king, but to these men. When the judges are sitting, someone is charged with the duty of acting as intermediary between the king and the judges. The principal food of the Khazars consists of rice and fish. The merchants dwell by preference in the part of the city which is situated on the eastern bank. There too may be found persons who profess Islam. Also, there are commercial establishments. As for the western part, it is the special abode of the king, his retainers, his troops, and Khazars of distinction. The language of the Khazars differs from all others. The Khazars do not resemble the Turks. They have black hair, and two sorts of them are distinguished. The one sort, called Khazars, are brown with a complexion so dark that it verges on black. You might take them for an Indian race. The other sort are white and perfectly beautiful. The Khazars, who in our country are sunk in slavery, belong to the idolaters, who, unlike the Jews, the Christians, and the Mussulmans, consider it lawful to sell their children and to sell each other. As to the government of the Khazars, the personage who occupies the first place bears the title of Khan of the Khazars. He ranks above the king of the Khazars, but it is from the latter that he receives his dignity. When they would appoint a Khan, they bring the person whom they have in view and draw a cord tightly around his neck. When he is on the point of choking, they say to him, "How long do you wish to keep this dignity?" He answers, "So many years." If he dies before the fixed term, they trouble themselves no more about him, but if, when the time comes, he is not dead, they put him to death. The dignity of the Khan is reserved for persons of a certain birth. The Khan has no power to command or to forbid, only they have the greatest regard for him, and when they enter his presence, they bow the head. No one but the king may enter his house, and the king does not visit him except in extraordinary cases. When the king enters the presence of the Khan, he prostrates himself on the ground and adores him. Then he rises and waits for the Khan to allow him to approach. In critical circumstances, it is customary for the Khan to come forth, but neither the Turks nor the other infidel nations of the country may see him. They are obliged to retire and avoid meeting him, out of respect for his rank. When the Khan is dead and buried, no one may pass before his tomb except on foot and with bowed head. A rider may not remount his horse till the tomb is out of sight. One of the things which show the great respect of the Khazars for their king is that sometimes the king desires the death of one of them, even one of the most powerful, and yet he does not wish to incur the responsibility for his death. Thereupon he orders the person to kill himself, and the man going home puts an end to his life. The dignity of the Khan is reserved for certain families, which exert no authority or power. When a man has been chosen to bear this title, they install him without taking account of his former condition. None are raised to the dignity of Khan but persons who profess Judaism. The golden throne and pavilion, which are to be seen among the Khazars, are reserved for the Khan. On the march, the tents of the Khan are placed above those of the king. Similarly, in the towns, the mansion of the Khan is higher than the mansion of the king. The language of the Bulgarians resembles that of the Khazars. From a comparison of these accounts, we gather that the Khazars, at the height of their power, were governed by two kings, a sacred and nominally supreme king, and a civil and nominally subordinate king, and that all real power centered in the hands of the civil king, while the nominal sovereign was little more than a venerable puppet who lived in almost absolute seclusion, seldom showing himself in public, remaining virtually invisible to the eyes of his subjects, and yet treated with marks of the most profound respect, if not of adoration, both in his lifetime and after his death. In this system of a double kingship, with its assignment of the shadow of power to one person and the substance of it to another, we trace those features of Roy Fonenants and mayors of the palace which are familiar to us in Merovingian history. The old line of hereditary monarchs had fallen into a political dotage and were practically superseded by a succession of vigorous ministers who were the real masters, while they professed themselves the humble servants of the feeble dotards on the throne. Yet, in the most stringent of the limitations imposed on the nominal sovereigns, we may detect a survival from a time when their ancestors were men of a stronger mold and a more masculine temper. We have seen that when a Khazar king reigned more than 40 years, even by a single day, he was ruthlessly put to death because his mental powers were supposed to be decayed and his wisdom impaired. The analogy of similar customs observed by many barbarous tribes suggests that the reason thus assigned by the Khazars for executing their kings after a fixed term of years was the true original motive. In ages of ignorance, men have often believed that the welfare of the state and even the course of nature are wholly dependent on the personal qualities of the king or chief who reigns over them, and that the decay of his bodily or mental powers must necessarily be accompanied or followed by a corresponding decay, not only in the commonwealth but also in those natural resources on which mankind is dependent for their very existence. Accordingly, subjects in those days took a very short way with superannuated sovereigns. They put them to death and raised up in their stead men who were yet in the prime of life and the full possession of all their faculties. A tightening or a relaxation, as the case might be, of the rope thus tied round the king's neck was introduced by the provision that he might reign till some public calamities, such as dearth, drought, or defeat in war, was thought to indicate that the dreaded enfeeblement of his Majesty's powers had really set in, whereupon the constitutional remedy was at once resorted to and the king was put to death. Clearly, the substitution of this rule might tend either to lengthen or to abridge the king's term of office according to his own natural abilities. The vigor of his constitution and the state of the weather for the inclemency of the season is imputed by many races to the defects of the ruler and is visited upon them accordingly. In the accounts of the Khazar monarchy, which I have quoted, certain discrepancies may be noted in regard to the constitutional check which regicide furnishes to the excesses or defects of kings. According to Ibn Fadlan, the king was regularly killed at the end of a reign of 40 years. According to Ibn Hawqal and Feda, he was put to death at the close of a period which, on being raised to the throne, he had himself determined under circumstances not altogether favorable to mature reflection, and according to Masudi, he suffered the extreme penalty of the law whenever drought or any other public misfortune had proved his unfitness to grasp the reins of power any longer. Which of these accounts is correct, we have apparently no means of deciding. Perhaps all of them were true at different times, for the Khazars may have allowed themselves a certain latitude in their application of the great principle of regicide, content with putting their effete kings out of the way without rigidly observing a pedantic uniformity in the manner and time of taking them off. The report which Ibn Hawqal and Abu Feda give of the mode of determining the length of the king's reign finds a curious parallel and perhaps a confirmation in the account which Chinese historians give of the manner in which the Daoqiu, or Turks, settled how long a Khan or prince should rule over them. When they proclaimed a Khan, the grandees carried him on a sheet of felt 9 times in a circle, following the course of the sun. At each circuit he was saluted by everybody. On the completion of these circuits, they mounted him on horseback and threw round his neck a piece of taffeta, with which they pinched him so tight that he almost expired. Then they slackened it and immediately asked him how long he expected to reign. The confusion of his mind did not allow him to answer the question exactly. Nevertheless, they regarded his answer as a prediction of the length of his reign. J.G. Frazer.